Okay, I guess we're all here. So the first instruction is you all have to go out into the convention floor and drag back one younger person. Not you two. You guys are immune to it. But you can find younger than you.
I saw a few babies.
No, my horse yet.
To enlighten.
My horse an undergrad. My horse an undergrad.
Well,
We've got an undergrad in here.
that's a good thing. To enlighten about Will, and just remind them we're going to talk about graphic novels in general as well as about Will's impact specifically. It would be good, even if you're not willing to go out now and do it because you'll miss some of our wonderful conversation. When we're done, tell somebody about Will Eisner. Just sort of whisper it, covertly in the hall. You want to know about Eisner?
Follow me.
I got some books for you. So, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Will would appreciate it, and we certainly appreciate it. Allow me to introduce the panelists that we have here. A wise gathering of people who know and understand Eisner from many, many different directions. Danny Fingeroth, former Spider-Man editor. Spider-Man obviously being one of Will Eisner's characters, or not quite.
He does whatever a spider can.
Indeed. But frequent comics historian, and
Will Eisner.
chair of Will Eisner Week. Don't tell people that, then they'll know. And currently working on a biography of this guy who seems to have stolen some of Will's thunder as the more popular DeWitt Clinton graduate from the Bronx, this guy named Lee something, who keeps popping up in movies.
Jim Lee?
It's unauthorized. Next to Danny, we have New York's only Curator of Comics and Cartoons, Ms. Karen Green from Columbia University, who guards all of our archives and is slowly mummifying the interesting cartoonists of New York to put them in Columbia's files.
Not all of them yet.
Few,
Not all of them yet, folks.
Some of us can still run fast enough to escape your grasp, Karen. Beyond her, the very tall Dennis Kitchen, mercifully in the center so that we can sort of go up and down in a nice pattern for photography. Dennis deserves significant credit for helping lure Will back into the world of comics at a New York comic convention a mere 47 years ago, and a long friendship with Will thereafter. And he had his own long career as a comics publisher, continues to do interesting books about comics history and collections of things, and occasionally even his own cartoons, though not nearly often enough for some of our tastes. Beyond Dennis, we have Chris Couch, a noted scholar of the world of the graphic novel and author of the Will Eisner Companion, which has more facts and history about Will than you'll find anywhere else.
Yeah, all the facts.
And holding up the far end, we have Mr. Dean HASPIEL, wonderful cartoonist, currently hawking the Red Hook from Image Comics, and considered by many to be sort of the comics mayor of the community in Brooklyn. Which
I've been told that.
by many, you've been accused of that by many people.
Yeah.
So if you need to know anything about New York's coolest borough's cartoonists, Dean probably can connect you up with them in the process.
And he won an Emmy.
Yeah.
For
comics.
That's not a bad thing. And,
It's not a bad thing, that's right.
and I'm Paul Levitz. I wrote Will Eisner, Champion of the Graphic Novel, still available for sale from Abrams because they have way more copies than they will ever sell to the human race, unless Charlie Kochman goes around selling them personally at the convention one-on-one. I keep trying to talk him into that and explaining that's really the least he owes me as his author, but I haven't won that battle yet. But a hopefully interesting book that not only traces Will's astounding creative life, but really sort of sorts out the chronology of the beginnings of the graphic novel here in America. So check it out if you're so inclined. And besides that, I've done a bunch of other strange things in comics, but they're not necessarily as germane to the conversation today. So we're here in part because, much like radioactive elements, creative people's work and reputation and connection to the world decays with a half-life. Which really is unfortunate. And everybody on this panel is interested not only in the history of the medium, but interested in how creative work stimulates other creative work, how the domino effect is important. If you're here, I'm going to make the assumption that you know something about Will Eisner and that you'd just like to know something more about his work, and you'll hear some of that over the course of the conversation. We also are here because we want to connect the story of Will Eisner, and again, I'm going to assume you know some of that, to the amazing stuff that's going on in the world of the graphic novel today. So let's start with the more scholarly souls on our panel. And yeah, I'll pick on our curator because I like picking on her. It's one of my hobbies.
He does, it's true.
Karen, talk to us a little bit about how the academic world views Eisner now.
Okay.
Academics are starting to actually look at the world of the graphic novel. How do they see Will connecting to that? And then we'll check with our real academic and we'll see.
See if he agrees with anything I've said.
Yeah.
What's interesting, and I'm guilty or responsible in this way myself, I teach a summer course at Columbia about close reading comics, and I always assign a contract with God. I think everybody I know who teaches a comics course, whether it's a history course, whether it's a literature course, whether it's a kind of thematic course, at some point assigns a contract with God, because not only is it a masterful work, although, like Citizen Kane, sometimes it's difficult to see its mastery because you've seen people who've been deriving their material from it for 40 years now. Not only is it a masterful work, but it represents such a departure and such a new direction in the medium. You've got somebody who is a kind of a stalwart of the earlier years of comics, and that kind of narrative meeting the undergrounds who are the underground cartoonists who are very expressive and personal and saying things that kind of dip into their own id or their own souls, and you're seeing those two strains meet in one place in a contract with God. Given not everybody understood, I think at the time, just how personal that book was, because how long was it before people understood about his daughter?
I think it was at least 20 years before I knew.
Yeah, 20,
Right.
30 years. Yeah.
So people didn't understand that first story was actually semi-autobiographical, but at the same time, it was clear that he made it clear that he was drawing on the Bronx of his youth, the tenements and neighborhoods of his youth, and this was a very new direction. There were people who were doing long form. I mean, Jules Pfeiffer comes out the same year, but it's a Pfeiffer story. It's not drawing on his own experience in quite the same way. And so this is a real departure, and I think that anybody who teaches in this medium or writes about this medium in the academic world has to engage with the role of a contract with God before they proceed to anything else in the history of the graphic novel.
Chris, you're shaking your head positively to reinforce this.
Oh,
Any holes you want to pick in it or anything you want to add to that?
no, that was completely awesome. It's funny, I want to talk about A Contract with God too, but I want to talk about Will Eisner as an educator, because Will really understood how comics could educate people. If you know about his career, you probably know about PS Magazine, which he did in the 40s and 50s, into the 70s almost, which was educational material for the military. And it was beautifully designed, it was highly effective. Will really understood that words and pictures can teach you much more than just words by themselves. And when he decided to basically elevate the comics form into a literary medium, he knew that he would have to educate people how to read a new form. And the thing that he did, it's starting with A Contract with God, which was brilliantly structured because it was 4 short stories. So it was a novel in the sense that Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles is a novel, right? Mm-hmm. It's a coherent work, but he led comics readers into novels using short stories. And then he understood that this new thing called the direct market was a way not just to give people books and comic books, but to teach people how to read comic novels, how to consume lengthy literary comics. And even though A Contract with God was a failure after it was published by Baronet, he kept creating graphic novels, getting them into the comic stores, because he was Will Eisner, people would buy them, and he taught people how to read graphic novels. A master educator who was also a businessman who used this new business medium to teach people something important. And I think that's, I personally believe that Will was absolutely a genius. And I've met a lot of geniuses. I've been to like the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and Will was always the smartest person in the room, so.
Okay. So Dennis, there's an argument to be made that this is all your fault. The story of Dennis in his very long-haired hippie moments meeting Will at New York Comic Con in '71 is recorded in many, many places at this point. I'm going to assume you've heard that. I'd like you to focus for a second on the journey from that meeting to Contract with God. You mentioned that there's a new deluxe two-volume edition of Contract out. Anybody who does not have Contract on their shelf, please rush out and buy that. But you had a long correspondence with Will and a long relationship with him in the 7 years between first meeting him and Contract coming out. Some of that was about the book itself. Some of it was about what was going on in the industry. Where did you think you were going with this nice old guy, who was then younger than you are now?
Yeah, when I first met Will, he was in his mid-50s, and I remember coming back. I came back and I said, I met the old man of comics. And it's all relative, yeah. I guess that meeting, in retrospect, it certainly underscored the fact that Will was insatiably curious and interested in what the younger generation was doing. So the influence was mutual. Virtually every cartoonist I knew had read and appreciated the Spirit and other places they had seen Will. But ordinarily, when a guy is in his 50s and already a legend, doesn't usually pay close attention to what the 20-somethings are doing. But in that regard, Will was different. And when the undergrounds were exploding, he asked that I regularly send them to him. And I eliminated, the more salacious ones, because there was a certain generation gap there. But for the most part, he was absolutely reading them and appreciating them, and especially the autobiographical ones, things that Justin Green in particular, Jack Jackson, even Crumb. I remember the first time he read Crumb, and he said, I'd like to do something like that, but I can't let it all hang out like he does. I was like, wow, speaking the vernacular. And so it'd be like today, pick an established, let's say Neil Adams went to SPX and came back and was all excited. It just doesn't happen very often. And so that was one of the unusual things about him, that there was a true interaction. And when he would meet young artists or artists of any age, he was always interested in engaging everything from technique to what fundamentally they wanted to say. He was interested in dialogue, no matter what your age was.
But what did you think was going to happen from this curiosity?
That's a good question.
Cast your head back to that
initially the fanboy in me, who was a publisher, was thinking, wow, I get to reprint the Spirits, which were rare. They were hard to find in their original form. And so it was like, I get to read them, and so will other fans.
Well, Dennis, you pursued, in a good way, a lot of people of that generation. I mean, there's a lot of correspondence with you and Stan Lee, and I would imagine other people.
Well,
so is it some
stay
overall...
on topic, Danny. Let's, yeah.
Well, no, but I'm saying it's part of an
Well,
overall...
it's true. Abby Hoffman, the so-called spokesman for hippies, said never trust anyone over 30, and I didn't buy that. I was very curious about what came before, and was very much interested in just getting access to the old material, which, again, if you go back to the late 60s, early 70s, no comic conventions, no books being reprinted. It was a wasteland. I could go into a library and be lucky to find 5 books on comics, and most of them were old and boring. So the thing about this period was it was exploding in all kinds of ways. So you had fanzines developing, so fans could talk to each other for the first time, and you had conventions starting to occur. That's how I met Will, at a Phil Sewing convention. It was my first, and I think his second. And so before that, the communication was minimal, and most of the professionals lived in or around New York, and they didn't meet people in other parts of the country. Will was embracing that, and so to get to the question of where I saw it going, I think initially I thought, I get to know this great guy and reprint the Spirit, and how cool is that? But when Will started expressing interest in doing new work, that was really exciting. And he started by just doing some new short Spirit things to kind of pad out the reprint books. And that was cool in itself. But when he told me around 1977, it must have been, that he was working on a new project, and he was very secretive about it, but he said it was all new original material, and it had nothing to do with the Spirit. I was intrigued. And that was the first clue I had that there's a whole new career ahead of this old-timer.
So I would support completely your statement that it's rare for those of us with gray hair to be curious about the cutting edge of what's going on in the process. It's one of the hardest things to be familiar.
To confirm that Spirit, I think it was Diana Schutz was at SPX in the mid to late 90s, and Will Eisner was a guest, and Diana Schutz was walking him around all the different cartoonists, pick point, that person, and she brought him over to Will over to me, and he looked through my semi-autobiographical comics and some Billy Dogma stuff, and at one point he looked at me and said, "You're the future of comics, kid," right? And I was like, oh my God. And then I was blown away. I'm sitting there like in this weird coma. And like 5 minutes later, I hear he's been brought down the hall. And I hear, "You're the future of comics, kid." But that was great because he was encouraging people, this master artist.
Johnny Appleseeding.
That's right. And I believed him too, And
he was right.
Thank you. But also what we're talking about here, I think, is I think what we're losing these days is context. Yeah. People are always, outraging on a headline and this and that, but sometimes you have to dig a little deeper. When you fall in love with a band and they do some interviews and you find out the stuff that they liked and you start buying what they like, older stuff. It's the same thing. When I started to fall in love with comics, I was like, well, who came before the people I'm currently reading? And it was people like Will Eisner, because Will Eisner's the original text, He's one of the progenitors of the form, one of the originators of the form, and the different careers he had throughout his life, if you think about the eras, of his career.
when you're 80 years old and they're introduced on a panel, it'll be the future of comics.
That's right. That's right.
I think that's my next question, specifically to you, Dean, because you're at that transition, right? You are at that solid moment where you have an audience. You started out for a long time as one of the more experimental, more radical creators who sort of straddled, maybe not, there is not exactly a modern underground, but the
Sure.
modern art scene
Sure.
and the artier part of the mainstream with your work for places like Vertigo.
The way I describe it is I'm too indie for the mainstream and too mainstream for the indie. That's
Okay.
what it always felt like to me.
And my vision isn't good enough to see if the gray hairs are starting to come in.
Starting. That's. I'm a young 51, everybody.
So how do you as a creative person keep that Eisner-like spirit
Oh.
in you? What do you do to keep connecting to the edge as you're doing your work?
Well, I mean, not only, listen, cartoonists are traditionally terrible at business. I'm not so great at that. But the stuff that I picked up from Eisner, if you are familiar with his work, I hope. If not, please pick up his stuff, is the theater in his work. You know, there was such theater, pantomime, behavior, observation. I loved the way he anthropomorphized the city. Made it come alive. It was a character, you know, and I've done that in my work. What else? Oh, I loved how he turned landscapes into a font. You know, like you open up a splash page and it says the spirit, but it's part of the architecture of the story. So, I mean, I'm inspired by the way he thought about comics and changed comics, of course, and just taking the baton as a creator and hopefully running with it as well in my own way, you know, and then inspiring other people, not only with my work, but they say, well, who did you read? Who did you like? I get to talk about Eisner. You know, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, C.C. Beck, Frank Miller.
How do you keep the curiosity alive, though? What's the coolest thing that you've run across in the last year that is the most different from what you do that attracted your attention?
Gosh, there's format and delivery system is something we can get into a little bit, like webcomics, digital delivery, that kind of stuff is very interesting, and that's what I've been doing since 2006. Different iterations of that, including Zuda at DC Comics, which was part of your initiative. So I think the format is an interesting thing to think about while producing these stories. But also just being vulnerable and personalizing. I also worked with Harvey Pekar a lot, you know, and I do like semi-autobiographical stuff. That's what I call it, although one would call it autobio. I call it semi-autobio because the truth is funny sometimes. It's a little blurry. But yeah, and being bold and taking risks. You said that when the book came out, Contract of God, it was a failure, and I think you mean a financial failure, obviously.
Failure, yeah.
Because it's not a failure at all. It's an amazing, but that's true of a lot of stuff when they first come out. So one thing is that if you're gonna double down and throw down the gauntlet, as it were, is to not worry about the financial currency. There's different currencies throughout, you know, creativity. And as long as you're reaching people and they're responding, that's the most important currency, because comics is a communication art, right? So communicate. And it's okay if people don't like your stuff. It's great when they love it, you know, but continue to strive and listen. And a lot of those PS magazines, what was also great about Eisner is his clarity. There was a lot of clarity in his work, which I think we're missing in comics more so these days. And I think that's also really important because it's about conveying information and serving your story.
Cool.
I'd like to say just one more little thing about teaching, which is I highly recommend Comics and Sequential Art by Will Eisner, which is based on his School of Visual Arts class. Neil Gaiman read that book and created this comic called Sandman that you might know. But one of the things that inspired Will was a bunch of young Turks, students at the School of Visual Arts, went to Silas Rhodes and said, we want comics back here. This is a comics school, we want comics back, you're not teaching comics. And he said, who should I get to teach here? And they said, we want Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman. He went out and got Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman. And one of the things that inspired Will, when people like Baton Lash and Ray Billingsley were his students to do this graphic novel, Contract with God, was his students at School of Visual Arts, because he would bring in the thumbnails and talk to them about what he was doing. So Will was in touch with people by going to cons and talking to young artists and reading things, and he was also inspired by his students. He was a consummate educator, and I can't recommend his educational books too highly. They're just amazing.
Cool. Danny.
Yes.
You may have the toughest job on the table, because,
Pouring the water.
well, your coordination is an issue, but we love you anyway. You've been the chairman of Will Eisner Week for the last couple of years, working with the Family Foundation, and that's a unique thing in comics. That's a very special effort to continue the reputation of an important creator, to continue the philosophy of an important creator, and to remind people about history. And as is extraordinarily evident in this country right now, we're really good about forgetting history and lining up and saying, can we make some of the old mistakes again? It really was wonderful putting the fork in our eye. Let me aim for that. Why do you do it? And talk about the work of the week, what Will Eisner Week means, because most people see it as a poster with a nice little thing on it and says something like, and we have 872 events in 493 places, and you're not really going to go to any of them, so we're not going to tell you what they are. But they're
to say, Paul.
but they're-
Don't beat around the bush.
but they're really cool.
Well,
So
as,
what do you guys actually do?
well, as a longtime comic book editor and freelancer, I have perfected nagging to an incredible, fine, diamond-tipped point of skill. So, as the chair of Will Eisner Week, my job is to ceaselessly nag people and explain to them why they need to do an event in their town. And I'm looking at all of you. In your town, in your school, in your store, in your living room. To do an event that is either directly about Will or somehow about graphic novels and why they're worth reading, studying, buying for Christmas gifts. With Carl and Nancy and the foundation, that's the role I see is, hey, Will Eisner is not only good for you, he's actually fun to read. And graphic novels as well. So why do I do it? I do it because for the big bucks. That's I have gotten quite wealthy being the chair of Will Eisner. I do it because Will, personally, although I wasn't a student of his, I met him a few times. He was far nicer to me than he had any need to be. It goes back. I sort of wanted to bring in Jules Feiffer. It goes back to Feiffer's great comic book heroes. For people of a certain age, in other words, those of us who were 12 in 1965, that book introduced us to Will Eisner and blew our minds. It was like, oh, there's this guy Will Eisner, and there's this thing called the Spirit. And it just opened up a lot of vistas that the other comic stuff didn't. So I think Will's work should be remembered, and not just remembered, but be ubiquitous and everywhere too. And
You can tell he's a writer.
so that's I like having that mission, and I like being able to put my nagging skills to work. Because I think there should be an event in 800 different places, and we'll put them all on the poster next year, or at least a link. So I think Will did great things, and inspires people like Dean and the other young people, even those under 50. And, and hopefully if you're in this room, you can spread that word too, because it's Will, and then Will as a catalyst for, what you, certainly what you see here, and even more so.
Okay, so let's go down the table, and I'd love each person to briefly talk about something that's happening in comics that Will would have loved, or something that's happening in comics that Will would have hated. Either a place like Mocha Fest that he would have certainly showed up and enjoyed wandering around, even though he would certainly be the oldest person in the room, but in many ways the youngest spirit in the room at the same time. Something he would love, either a book that was published this year or recently that you think he would have gotten a particular kick out of, or an event, or something he would have really detested about what's going on in comics right now. Because there's a couple of things. Dean?
Well, one of you want to say he would have loved the Red Hook? Weird coming out from me.
It's the future of comics.
The future of comics. I actually think he would have loved the Red Hook. So that's what he would have liked. What would he have detested?
He would have loved it more if it was set in the Bronx.
That's true, instead of Brooklyn.
Yeah.
That's true. Although I can work on that. We can get to the Bronx.
You are the past of comics.
The past of future comics. What would he have detested? I mean, do you want to say Comicsgate? Do you want to actually say that out loud?
Absolutely.
I mean, of course he would have detested that, right?
Appalled him.
I mean, come on. I actually, in a way, I wonder how, because as cartoonists we respond to things, I wonder how he would have responded to the current climate as a cartoonist.
Interesting.
That would be interesting. What was the last book you did? It was
Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
The Protocols.
The plot.
The plot, right? Yeah.
He was very political.
Yes.
And he was threatening that the next book would be the Quran
Really?
as a graphic novel.
Oh wow!
Oh my Lord.
2 months before he died, he was seriously considering it.
Wow! Wow!
That would have been interesting.
Did he? I mean, I don't. I know a lot about Eisner, but what did he officially detest in written? Historically, voiced what he didn't like. Do you know?
I remember his pet peeve was comic books that were mostly about the illustration and the story was kind of incoherent.
That's happening a lot.
Like beautiful graphic novels that just didn't make much sense.
Right.
That he hated the most. He would rather see primitive art with a strong story.
With a strong story, and in comics, image is text too, and it's very clear that he used his drawings to as writing.
Absolutely.
So I think he probably would be like, this isn't a story. Where's the story here? What's going on? It's pretty. It looks weird. It's strange. Whatever, and that's cool. But where's the story? And I think also maybe comics are trying to break the fact that, or not the fact. I think that there's an argument maybe that comics aren't necessarily about story, but I don't agree with that. I think comics is storytelling. Anyway, I don't know if you would have detested anything, current that's experimental,
Well, he was not a big fan of the superhero, so he might have been a little dismayed at all the multi-billion-dollar superhero
You mean like the
movies
cinematic universes right now? and whatnot?
dominating, the world.
Remember, Paul knows this story. When Paul started doing the Spirit archives, and it had been preceded, of course, by the Superman archives and the Batman archives, and Paul called Will to say, Spirit Volume 1 outsold the first Batman and the first Superman archive, and Will said, I knew in a fair fight the Spirit would beat the shit out of them.
Yeah. That's great. And speaking of the Spirit, so I love Darwin Cook, rest in peace. And I know he did, 12 issues or more of the Spirit? And other people have. In fact, I was asked to draw the Spirit with Matt Wagner, and then I was just busy, and I also felt really weird. It's one of those things that it's honored to be asked, but then I'm like, that's Will Eisner's comic.
Yeah.
But then, didn't he work with other artists on the Spirit? you know. So there was a collaboration there, and I'm kind of curious to know what he would have thought of latter iterations of the Spirit.
I think one of the most amazing things about Eisner is the fact that that original body of Spirit work is done so factory style and yet so auteurly his, despite the fact that almost every one of them has many hands attached to it.
He's like a showrunner of the Spirit in a way, you know.
In a sense, we've never seen that kind of harmony achieved, where the art still ultimately felt like it was the same man's work, even though many people participated on many of the issues. Chris?
Yeah. When I teach Will Eisner's work, I always teach him as a feminist. And I think he would be excited by the strong female protagonists, the work of like Molly Ostertag or Jillian Tamaki, or people like that. If you look at the Spirit, he created the strongest women characters in the 1940s. Piguel is a French teacher and a school headmistress. All of the women have professions. Ellen Dolan becomes mayor over the Spirit's objections. It's a very feminist comic book in a way that you don't see elsewhere. He had strong women characters in all of his graphic novels, and I think he would be very excited about that.
Dennis?
I think he'd like these artist editions, showing the actual originals, since most people can't afford them or get to see them. I think the craft of comics, he'd appreciate that being shared. And I think that the tendency toward museums and institutions exhibiting comic art and treating it with respect is something he would have seen as inevitably happening. Be happy with it.
And the price of comic book original art.
That too. That would appeal to the businessman who will very much.
He would groan even louder at the old pages that had been destroyed to preserve the valuable printing plates.
That's right.
Yeah. He'd figure out exactly how many dollars he'd lost in the process. Karen?
We've touched several times on his interest in what was new, and as many of you probably know, he would personally present the Eisner Awards in San Diego to each winner. And so on top of going around from tables to table, he would meet people as they won in this kind of moment of triumph. And as Dennis said, I can't imagine Neil Adams doing that. The closest I've ever seen is Chris Ware.
Let's bring Neil in and ask him.
I think he's busy.
Neil, we got some work. We got some work for you, and everybody in the room will kick in the $5 as though they were buying your signature. But
some good groans out there.
never mind.
The closest I've seen to that is Chris Ware, when he can be dragged out of his home to a con. I see at SPX, there'll be like students at SCAD or CCS will walk up to him and kind of tentatively, shakingly hand him a mini comic, and he'll stand there and he'll look through the whole thing, and then he'll talk to them about it. And even in one of Jeffrey Brown's autobiographic novels, he talks about meeting Chris Ware at a con, and Chris kind of takes him under his wing and shows him the ropes and gets him introduced to things. And I think that in the current climate, with the incredible variety, I'm thinking of what Will would have made of something like Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters, which just doesn't look like anything that anybody's ever seen before. And if you haven't read it, you should read it, buy it right after you buy the new 2-volume edition of Contract with God, with nice bookends. I think that he would be blown away. I think he would be blown away by that. I wonder, I don't know that he would detest, but I wonder what he would think of the rise of digital cartooning, of things done entirely on a Wacom and colored in Photoshop. And I just, to me personally, so much of that looks kind of flat and lifeless and plastic, and
there's no archive for you to.
And there's no.
Yeah.
Well, you can't get it signed, right? How do you get it signed? How do you sell the original art? You know, what's
Don't
the
look at
Buy
me.
a lot of
what's the percentage for a cartoonist in doing digital art? So
you buy a lot of Wakems and get each one signed by an artist. It's a conspiracy.
So I don't know that he would detest it, but I wonder what he would think of that kind of one stage removal of the human hand. I know that the human hand is drawing on the Wacom, but whatever. And just to bring back Comicsgate, I think that he would be perplexed at why anybody would be protesting inclusion of as many people trying to get into comics as possible. I don't know that, I think he would detest it, but I think he would be mystified by it, as many of us are mystified by it.
Yeah. What? I keep hearing this 2-volume thing. What? What is this?
Will's come back to do a whole sequel.
Really?
You know, he could do things the rest of us can't. He got bored up in heaven. He's just said, hey,
Now that he met God, he's changing that contract. No.
nice line.
Quick explanation.
Yes.
Is the only time Will did this, as you know, a cartoonist normally does the pencil underdrawing and inks it. When Will did a contract with God, he did his tight pencils and then he put vellum over it.
Vellum.
And he inked the vellum over his pencils. As a result, the original pencils survived.
Right.
So there's a 2-volume set where you can see an entire volume of the preliminary drawing versus the finish, and you get to see what changes he made and the pages he left out.
That's better than an artist edition.
It was done kitchen sink imprint of Dark Horse. So it's available. It's just been out for a few months.
Oh, it's new. Okay.
Yeah.
Danny?
Yeah, I think it's $125, but it's beautiful.
2 volumes, so it's really only,
Only
It's
$62.50.
it's amazing to see. What, Ron?
So I have a question because this Comicsgate stuff has come up.
We're still,
Oh, you're still.
yes, we're still.
he hasn't
but-
gone yet.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We'll get you in a minute, Rob.
I'm sorry.
Somebody's got to kill the last 15 minutes of this. You can start that part of the process.
I think Will would be tickled by Jules Pfeiffer again, by his current trilogy.
Yes.
Jules is young; he's not 90 yet. He's barely
kid.
he's barely 89. Jules has had this I mean, he's always been productive, but this especially productive past few years, where he's done a trilogy of graphic novels. I guess it's known as the Kill My Mother trilogy. Kill My Mother.
Brother Joseph,
Cousin Joseph,
Cousin Joseph.
Cousin
right,
Joseph,
sorry,
and
the script.
and the Ghost Script, and he's always been very upfront and vocal about his debt and love of Eisner. I think they butted heads some also over the years, but this trilogy is so Eisnerian, both in theme and visual, and especially the third volume is, he said that he, felt like he had Will on his shoulder as he was writing and drawing this, and whether as a reader you think it's faithful or not to Will, or I mean it's I think Will would have been tickled by the full circle that Jules's career has taken, as he's essentially done like this 300 page or more homage to Will, and yet it's you look at it and it's definitely Pfeiffer. So I think he would have gotten a kick out of that.
Cool.
Yeah, it's interesting too. If Jules got a job when he was 15,
Yeah.
had Will not allowed him to be the office boy and learn the craft to the point that he was writing scripts at the end, would Jules have stayed in comics? Would he have gone in a whole different direction?
Given how multimedia, multi-talented he's been along the way.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I think Will would have been fascinated by what's going on here, not this room specifically. This he might have. He would have enjoyed. He liked the world caring about him. But what's going on in this building? I think those first small conventions where he met Dennis, the earlier one that he went to, he found really interesting. But I don't think he would have imagined the sheer size that we've gotten to, whether it's for New York Con or San Diego Con. He passed just as San Diego was beginning to be a monster. And even San Diego is very different than New York in the sense that there's many more people upstairs curious about more things that somehow touch on comics in some fashion and are sort of, well, I want a day out. Let me have a cultural day in popular culture. I don't know that it's phrased that way in many people's minds, but that seems to be of the essence of it. And I think he would just stand there and watch the parade of humanity. And I do think he would watch the diversity of that parade of humanity with great joy. The idea that comics aren't for everyone is so antithetical to everything he spent his life building, teaching, pronouncing. He regretted his own moments of youthful foolishness and limited view of the world that created some characters that embarrassed him later on in life. But he created those when he was young and not in touch with a wider world, and where the culture was racist in many ways, deeper than even our current sad moments. And as a grown man, he wanted any creature that was walking. If it could walk, if it could talk, if it could react to his work, he'd be happy to have it read. If an alien showed up, he'd have been the first one to welcome them.
With a comic.
With a comic, and probably drawn into a comic. So I think that he would really take joy in that aspect of what's going on. That so many people were finding joy and solace and pleasure in the world of comics. And he'd kick anybody who tried to make it otherwise. We have about a dozen minutes left, depending on when exactly they throw us out. Rob had his hand up first, so he gets first shot.
Yeah, just to follow up on what you were saying there, like, because of the moment that we're in, sort of politically fraught, and the fact that, you know, that, for example, DC canceled the Monster Society of Evil book because of issues of representation, even archaic, even explained by the Times, that Crumb got a hostile reception when his name came up at SPX because of these kind of issues. How do the scholars and the people on the panel, I guess, how would you recommend that we respond to that kind of criticism of Will's work at the same time when we're largely sympathetic to the people that are raising those issues? Those are valid issues. How do we preserve Will's legacy that when we recognize the totality of his contribution and still say, yeah, but that was not so good?
So, Chris, why don't you take that first and maybe talk about it in the broader context beyond Will, but how scholars deal with the difference between the person, the work, and the times.
Well, look, I have an answer to this, which is we're talking about minority characters in the Spirit, okay? And if you look at Will's biography, he came to understand racism during World War II. If you read his book, To the Heart of the Storm, that is Will writing about his coming to terms with racism and learning about equality, tolerance, diversity, all of those things. That's in that book. If you actually look at the Spirit and read all of the stories about the Spirit Sidekick, his African-American sidekick, Will attempted, after World War II, to change that character. He went through many iterations. He turned him into a film director. He did many different things. He created Lieutenant Gray, who is an African-American character who speaks standard English, is completely professionally competent, and eventually Will realized he could not redeem the sidekick character and dropped it from the strip. So if you look at his actual work, there's an evolution based in his World War II experiences that's usually not remarked upon, and it's quite a powerful moment of someone coming to understand. And Will always said, when I brought him to UMass, he said, look, I was wrong. I apologize for that character. You know, no matter what the times are, you are personally responsible for that. So that's what I would say, okay? And so I think there's an example that Will gave. And then, of course, his last works, again, he turned to that educational moment, to the plot, The Secret History of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it was trying to fight racism and intolerance with comics. And I think that's a mission that if we could explain that to the people who are saying, well, you know, Will did these things, look, he understood the power of comics to personally show his internal change, his rejection of racism and intolerance, and to use comics as a powerful medium to fight these things. I think that's the way to talk about Will and race.
I think context is the key, and also the fact that we, as artists, grow up in public. Think about that, all right? And now with the internet and Twitter and all this stuff, everything you say, like if you say this one bad, stupid thing, it condemns you for the rest of your life, and there's no forgiveness anymore. And like, that's ridiculous. Put it in context.
I think
Accept an apology, you know?
in addition, we have a tendency to want to erase things from our past that we're ashamed of, instead of recognizing them, understanding, explaining them. You know, whether it's taking FDR's cigarette holder off of him on a stamp, or, you know, questioning characters in Huckleberry Finn, right up through, there's a story in one of the Mary Poppins books that has some extremely unfortunate characters that she actually rewrote in her lifetime in the 70s to turn them into animals instead of people. But to a certain extent, if we sweep this all under the rug, then we are refusing to come to terms with our own past. And if you forget your past, or if you ignore your past, it's just going to come out of the deep and bite you in the ass all over again.
Uh-oh.
So, right, and that's a bad thing. So, I think that contextualizing, as Dino says, is crucial. I think that education is crucial, but I think that you don't throw out Mark Twain because of Huckleberry Finn. You don't throw out the New Deal because of FDR's cigarette holder. You know, you just, and you don't throw out the Spirit because of Ebony White. You explain him. You don't present him without context. It's the work of the editor and the publisher to footnote, to editorialize, to explain, and not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
In the green shirt, please.
This is a question clearly from ignorance. What is Comicsgate? I've heard references
Oh,
to
you
it.
lucky, lucky man.
I'd rather know.
Who wants to take that?
There's a movement of uncertain size, but great vocal volume, that argues that the American comics field has been damaged by an emphasis on diversity of characters and diversity of readers. No, I believe Christ has not taken that position. I'm not.
That was in lieu of another word.
And because of the anonymity of the internet, they're able to be very vocal, vituperative, vindictive, and nasty.
And harmful.
And harmful, yeah. You know, so it's...
It's make America white again.
Yeah, make comics white again.
There are several young, particularly female creators, who have been harassed on the internet to extreme levels in the course of this.
Horrifically.
And Will would not have approved.
But I think in a way that you're asking that question, I like that, because it means that it's kind of a tempest in a teapot, and maybe,
so.
although we're all, addicted to like reading about it on Facebook, I'm hoping it's a smaller issue than it feels like to some of us.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I really liked what you had to say
about Will Eisner being a champion of diversity. And he's the reason I'm here, because when a 12-year-old Indian American kid came up to him in a comic convention in 1985, Will was so gracious, and he read my whole comic, and he said, "Laserman, that's a great name. You can copyright it right away." That's the reason I'm here. So, when you were discussing earlier, how to explain Will Eisner and why he's so relevant, he affects and has influenced every comic book artist to this day, whether directly or indirectly, and that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, it's a family tree. And there were those who affected Eisner, like Kniff, very powerfully. So it's not that Will is the Garden of Eden of comics, but he's a very seminal figure, particularly for the comic book page. And there he's very close to our Garden of Eden, because as you moved from the newspaper strip to the comic book page, there were new things you could do. And Will was there at that moment, and perhaps was the particular genius of inventing how to use that page. And you look at those things now, it's like, yeah, this wheel thing's pretty obvious. It's a handy way to move stuff around. But at the time, wheel, fire, kind of made a difference. We have time maybe for one more question. Sure.
Okay, now I'm blanking, of course. I've had the hand up forever. So you guys are talking all about the importance and his, relevance, and I can't put this to words, his tackling of just the modern issues and really full on. And the fact that if we didn't have him, would we have had the graphic novel writers who did, wow, I can't speak, I apologize.
Okay. You're doing fine.
Art Spiegelman with Mouse and stuff like that, and just, would we have ever been able to get something like that without Will Eisner and what he was able to give us and to the comic world?
We wouldn't have gotten Laserman without Will Eisner. I'm just saying right there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laserman.
I think, there are two grand theories of history that you hear argued: the great man theory and the forces of history. And history professors have been arguing back and forth their positions on these things since the beginning of history, I think.
Since the beginning of professors.
Since the beginning of professors. You mean they weren't there at the beginning of history? They keep telling us they were.
They really, really weren't.
I think you can argue both. The potential of the graphic novel was there to be unlocked. Would it have been unlocked this way at this time? Would it have grown this way in America without Will? We don't know. Would it have gotten there eventually? I certainly believe so. But I'm very grateful to Will for inspiring, not so much Spiegelman, because Art was already at work on Mouse, but Frank Miller for The Dark Knight Returns, and Alan Moore for Watchmen, and
Dean Haspiel's The Red Hook, which you can buy right now.
I forgive him for inspiring Dean for The Red Hook, and me, and so many other creators who vividly remember getting Contract with God in 1978 and saying, "Wow, you can do this? Maybe I can do better than I'm doing now. Maybe I can do more." And in Will's spirit, I commend you to go out there, to do more, to do better.
And to buy something you've never seen before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Try something a little different that you see out there, and tell somebody about Will's name. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.